To those who... Well, evidently, something came on somewhere along the line. About the time I had despaired, and figured I would ask if those in the back of the room could hear, then we've got this on. So, anyway, sounds like we got it cranked up now. Oh, well. Better not get this one cranked up too loud, or it might blast you out of your seats before I get finished today. I want to address a subject that I think is one of the most important subjects because the Bible has so much to say on the subject. We are told in the book of James, chapter 1 and verse 26, if any man among you seems to be righteous, seems to be religious, and bridles not his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is vain. We're told right here in James 1 and verse 26 that bridling the tongue, controlling what we say, is one of the vital components of true religion. That if we seem to be religious, if we give the appearance and the image and the impression of being a religious person, and yet we don't control what comes out of the mouth, we're told that our religion is vain. I think that qualifies this as an extremely important subject because none of us want to have God view our religion as vain, futile, empty, hollow. We're told in James chapter 3 and verse 5, even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindles. How great a matter a little fire kindles. The tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members. It defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell. For every kind of beasts and of birds and of serpents and of things in the sea is tamed, and has been tamed of mankind, but the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. Therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. So, the Scriptures lay great emphasis, and we're going to see some of this emphasis on the subject of the tongue. We're going to see some uses and misuses of the tongue, because it is a subject that all of us certainly need to take very, very seriously. It is a subject that perhaps we have not focused upon and addressed frequently enough, because it is a matter, from a scriptural standpoint, of very great importance. In the book of Romans, chapter 1, we are told of individuals in verse 28 who did not like to retain God in their knowledge. They did not want to retain a knowledge of God. They did not desire to acknowledge God in their lives. And we're told that God gave them over to a reprobate mind, a mind that is devoid of judgment, to do the things that are not convenient, things that are not appropriate. Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Now, there are quite a number of things that are listed here, but if we start going through, we find that a number of the things that the Apostle Paul listed right in the same category with murder, right in the same category with haters of God, are a number of things that have to do with the misuse of the tongue. Let's pick out some of these that have to do with the misuse of the tongue, and let's understand some of these a little more clearly. One of the things that the Apostle Paul mentions in chapter 1 and verse 29, the first issue that has to do with the tongue is debate. Now, what does that mean, debate? Is he primarily concerned about debating clubs at school? What does he have reference to? The word that is rendered debate here is a word that in nearly every other case in the New Testament is translated as either strife or contention. It is a word that reflects an argumentative, strife-filled, contentious spirit. Let's notice some examples of that, of this spirit of strife and contention that reflects itself in this misuse of the tongue, called here debate in the sense that an argumentative, strife-filled, contentious use of the tongue. Proverbs 16:28, we're told a froward man sows strife. A whisperer separates chief friends. A froward man sows strife. Just as you would sow seed to raise a crop, here we're told that a froward man, a corrupt man, a man who is not inclined to God, sows strife. So strife plays a big part, a big role in his life, in what he does. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, it talks about individuals in verse 4 who are proud, knowing nothing, but doting about questions and strifes of words, whereof comes envy, strife, railings, evil surmisings, perverse disputings of men of corrupt mind, destitute of the truth, supposing that gain is godliness. From such withdraw yourself. Now, one of the reasons that God hates this argumentative spirit, this spirit of debate, is because it both reflects an attitude of mind and heart, and it engenders consequence in the lives of others. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, Jesus said. So, when an individual is argumentative, when they sow strife, when they're contentious in their conversation and in their dealings with others, they reflect an inner attitude of strife and contention. And we're told here in 1 Timothy 6 that this sort of an individual dotes about questions and strifes of words, likes to argue, and the result of this sort of argumentative, striving, contentious spirit is envy, strife, railings, and evil surmisings. It leads into all sorts of problems. It engenders envy. It engenders strife and railings, which are loud, accusative type of statements. Evil surmisings, assuming the worst about people. So there are attitudes that are reflected. Attitudes that are reflected, an approach to life. In James 3, we've already read some of James 3, but let's notice on down a little further in James 3:13. It says, "Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation, a good conduct, his works with meekness and wisdom. But if you have bitter envying and strife in your heart," this spirit of debate, "if that's in your heart, glory not and lie not against the truth." Don't kid yourself. Because this wisdom descends not from above. This is not something that derives from God, but it's earthly, sensual, devilish, and where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. Where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. You know, if you go back and you look at the examples of this contentious, argumentative, strife-filled spirit, as you look through the pages of Scripture and as we look at examples around in life and in our own personal experience, the consequences of this kind of thing are evident. The use of the tongue is so important because it both reflects an inner spirit, an inner attitude. It reflects what's on the inside, and it brings what's on our inside out to impact and to affect others. So it is a means by which we influence others. We can bring out the best in people, or we can bring out the worst in people as a result of what we say. And one of the first issues that the Apostle Paul addresses here relating to this is this spirit of strife, this spirit of debate, in the sense of an argumentative, strife-filled, contentious spirit. Somebody who is ready to always to argue and to contend. It is not a good characteristic. It is not a positive thing. We're told, the Apostle Paul told Timothy that the man of God must not strive. That's not something that God wants, is this strife-filled, argumentative, contentious spirit. Somebody who is ready to incite contention, to incite argument and strife. Because that reflects a wisdom that does not come from above. We're told it's earthly, it's from below, it's sensual, it's of the human senses, it's devilish. You know, that's the attitude that Satan has. This, because it goes back to a self-centered, self-willed, I want what I want, sort of an attitude. Now, right along with debate, the Apostle Paul went right on in Romans chapter 1, and the next thing he mentioned was deceit. Now, deceit, of course, is a little different. On the one hand, we're looking at an argumentative, contentious spirit. Somebody who is ready to always to argue and to contend and is filled with just a desire for their own way and to contend and argue about it. Now, here we're looking at deceit, which, of course, involves another misuse of the tongue. In Psalm chapter 34, we might pick up something here that reflects on this. In Psalm 34, in verse 13, it says, "Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking guile." Now, this word guile is a word that has to do with deceit or hypocrisy, because that's what deceit is. This is hypocritical speaking. This is speaking that is loaded with guile, with an intent to deceive or to mislead. This, of course, is what we see with Satan the devil when he showed up in the Garden of Eden. What did he evidence but deceit? Has God said that you shall not eat of any of the trees of the garden? Oh yes, we may eat of the trees of the garden, all of them except this one that grows here in the midst of the garden. God has said, you shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. And Satan said, you shall not surely die. Oh no, you won't die. No, you see, this is the best one. God didn't tell you He's keeping this one for Himself. He knows that in the day you eat thereof, you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. You'll be like God if you eat this one. But he knew better. He deceived Eve. He practiced deceit. Jesus Christ said, Satan the devil is a liar and the father of a lie. He is a liar and the father of a lie. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, because he's a liar and the father of a lie. It reflects this deceitful approach, this misleading approach. An attempt to mislead, to deceive, to somehow maneuver and manipulate and to get our own way, to bring about some results. There are all sorts of motives people can have for deceit, but it comes back as a reflection of something that is the very opposite of the character and nature of God. Jesus Christ said, I came to bear witness of the truth. Now Pilate, speaking like someone that was impressed with the Greek philosophy of his day, said, what is truth? Well, Jesus Christ came to bear witness of the truth. And He told us, He explained that He is the truth. He is the way. And He came to bear record and witness of the truth. In Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 16, we have an enumeration of the things that God hates the most. These 6 things does the eternal hate. Yea, 7 are an abomination to Him. A proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood. A heart that devises wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaks lies, and he that sows discord among brethren. Now, if we start going through here, we find that at least 3 out of the 7 reflect very specifically a misuse of the tongue. A lying tongue, that's about as much related to the tongue as you can get. That certainly reflects the spirit of deceit. A lying tongue. A false witness that speaks lies. And he that sows discord among brethren. Now, we're going to come a little more to that one in just a moment. But this attitude of deceit, a lying tongue, a false witness that speaks lies, someone that can't be counted on to tell the truth. He's going to perhaps say what is to his advantage, or he's going to say what he thinks others wish to hear. He is not someone who can be counted upon to tell the truth. And we find over and over examples of individuals who really were not lovers of the truth. One of the things that the Apostle Paul warned Timothy about, he said that the time will come when even some of those in God's church will not have that love of the truth. They will heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. They want to hear what they want to hear. They say, prophesy to us smooth things. Prophesy deceits. Preach smooth things. Help us to just simply feel good about ourselves. Well, Jesus Christ had no room and He had no place for deceit. He told the truth. He bore record and witness of the truth. God's Word is truth. And if we're to reflect the character and nature of God, there's no room for deceit. That ties in with guile, with hypocrisy, with all the cover-ups. We see this sort of thing come through our national media on a regular basis, over and over and over. And of course, when politicians do it, or people in high business or industry do it, it attracts attention and publicity because people know them, and their conduct attracts publicity. But it goes on right on down to on the smallest scale. It goes down everything from a little kid in grade school cheating on his test to copying the answers off of the little kid in front of him or beside him, right on up to the very highest echelons of government. We have it practiced on a grand scale. It avoids confronting the real issues and the real problems. You heard what they're going to do to solve a large part of Louisiana's budget crisis and impending deficit, don't you? They're going to revise the bookkeeping methods. Now, that will certainly solve things. You revise the bookkeeping methods. In other words, you practice deceit with numbers. You just cook them around and you don't add some of them up. And you just revise the way you figure it. You got the same figures. What's the old saying? Figures don't lie, but liars can sure figure. We see this sort of thing all throughout. It's not unique to our state. It's not unique to our nation. It is a characteristic of human nature. But it's not a characteristic of God. This argumentative, strife-filled, contentious spirit. That's not the spirit, that's not the attitude of God. It said of Jesus Christ when He came that He would not strive. He didn't get out there and engage in all sort of argumentation and contention and strife with the Pharisees. He simply told the truth. He did not practice deceit. Now let's notice one of the next things that's mentioned there in Romans chapter 1 is whisperers. Whisperers. Now what does that mean? Does that mean you shouldn't say something to your neighbor in church? Don't lean over and whisper to your neighbor. Is that what they're primarily talking about? Well, no, there are other things that would apply to that. But whisperers has to do let's just notice here in Psalm 41. Here's a very good illustration of what is meant by a whisperer. A whisperer. Let's pick it up, verse 5 of Psalm 41. My enemies speak evil of me. When shall he die and his name perish? If he come to see me, he speaks vanity. His heart gathers iniquity to itself. When he goes abroad, he tells it. All that hate me whisper together against me. Against me do they devise my hurt. An evil disease, say they, cleaves fast to him. Now that he lies, he shall rise no more. Yes, mine own familiar friend, in whom I had trusted, which did eat of my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. Will you, O Lord, be merciful unto me, and raise me up, that I may requite them. Now, here, let's notice this spirit that is described here. Here are people that he describes as enemies, but these weren't open enemies. These were people that, on the one hand, had outwardly been his friend. Yes, my own familiar friend in whom I trusted. Somebody that I had sat down and eaten meals with, somebody that I thought was my friend. But it describes them in verse 6. His heart gathers iniquity to itself. When he goes abroad, he tells it. It's talking about a gossip, a talebearer. Somebody who's coming around trying to pick up little tidbits, trying to find out the dirt. And when he goes abroad, he tells it. Any little tidbit, any little bit of information or misinformation that he can go and spread abroad. We've got a whole industry in this country, the tabloids in particular, that really they make their living off of this sort of thing. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or false. They're quick to pick it up and to spread it abroad. I'm going to tell you something. There's not going to be any of those in the world tomorrow. There's not going to be any of those. There's not going to be any of that kind of thing. God's not going to allow that sort of thing. Here are those. His heart gathers iniquity to itself. When he goes abroad, he tells it. All that hate me whisper together against me. Against me do they devise my hurt. All over here on the sly, they're getting together and talking about this person, and they're running them down and criticizing. They say, he's sick. He's sick. He's probably going to die. So now they get a rumor going. He's as good as dead. There is not this attitude of wishing well, but a whisperer. Now, we've already noticed in there are many places that we could go in the book of Proverbs. It's filled with admonitions. One of the things we saw in Proverbs 16:28, a whisperer separates chief friends. One of the things that a whisperer does, one of the things that a spreader of slander and gossip does, is separate friends. That's something that God absolutely hates. One of the seven things, the culmination of what God hates, the seventh thing that is the culmination of what God hates, is he that sows discord among brethren. Somebody that goes around and spreads gossip and rumor and tales that creates discord and division and disunity. One of the things God absolutely hates the very most. He that sows discord among brethren. That's a terrible thing in God's eyes. A whisperer separates chief friends. A spreader of gossip and tales and rumor mongering. That's a horrible thing in God's eyes, and yet we can become so much a part and so infected and affected, infected by as well as affected by the world around us, that sometimes we can get where we really don't see what's quite so bad about a little bit of good, juicy gossip. Well, God says in Proverbs 18:8, the words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down to the innermost parts of the belly. It's like a sharp arrow or spear or knife. If you've ever had gossip and rumors spread about you, you know what that means. It cuts way down to the heart and core. And how do you go about undoing it? If somebody spreads gossip and rumors about you, how do you disprove a rumor? You know, it's one of the reasons God hates it so much, because the individual about whom it's spread is so absolutely powerless to do anything about it. What can you do? If you go around and start denying it, then people say, aha. Yeah, where there's smoke, there's fire. Hit dog hollers. They have all these comments, you see. They've got it figured out. You go around and you deny it, you call attention to it. And people wonder why you're making such a big fuss about it. So they say, yeah, must have gotten caught. So you don't come out ahead by denying it. If you ignore it, you don't say anything, well, you still don't know what's being said and what's going to be believed. The words of a talebearer are as wounds. They go down to the innermost parts of the belly. They stab and cut right down to the innermost part of a person's being. That's one of the most horrible things that can be done. One of the things that God absolutely hates the most. A whisperer separates, chief friends. The words that get said, the rumors that get spread, the gossip that is told, these things cast a pall over friendships. They create suspicion among and between people. Individuals who at one time were so close to one another now have a certain element of suspicion in their dealings. Let's just notice a couple of other places. Proverbs chapter 26 and verse 20. It says, where no wood is, there the fire goes out, and where there's no talebearer, the strife ceases. Where no wood is, the fire goes out. Where there's no talebearer, the strife ceases. Now, this is an important part of understanding here that here is a source of strife. Here's someone that engenders strife because of the things they spread. They spread a lot of gossip. Let's notice back in the law in Leviticus chapter 26, in Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 16. It says, you shall not go up and down as a talebearer among your people. Neither shall you stand against the blood of your neighbor. I am the eternal. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall in any wise rebuke your neighbor and not suffer sin upon him. If you've got something to say to somebody, say it to him. You don't go up and down as a talebearer among your people. If you've got a problem with your neighbor, with your brother, you shall in any wise rebuke your neighbor, not suffer sin upon him. You see somebody, if there's a legitimate problem, you go to the individual. You go to the individual, you don't go to everybody else and say, guess what he's doing? Guess what she's doing? Some people excuse gossip because they say it's true. Why, it's not gossip, it's true. It's still gossip. It's still gossip. If it's true, if it's not true, then it's both gossip and deceit. But if it's just, God hates whisperers and hates this sort of attitude. You shall not go up and down as a talebearer among your people. A spreading of tales, a repeating of rumors, a spreading of innuendo and accusation. casting aspersions on someone's reputation, trying to run somebody down. There is no place for that. You know, Jesus said, if you've got a problem with your brother, you go to him. And let it first be between him and you alone. And if he'll hear you, you've gained your brother. And then he says, if he won't hear you, then you get a witness. You get somebody to go with you. Someone that is mutually respected. Don't just get your buddy who you know is going to agree with you. Get someone that you both respect and someone that can sit down as sort of an impartial third party. And if there comes a point where it cannot be resolved, then there comes a point where the church has to be involved. In some matters, the church has to be involved perhaps at an early stage because of the seriousness or the severity of the problem. Galatians says, if you see a brother or sister overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual restore such a one. Sometimes you see someone overtaken in a fault that is of a nature, is of a severity, that you're not able to give them the help you need, but then you don't go and talk to everybody else. You know, I don't talk about people's problems to other people. Not that sort of thing is just, there's no place for spreading gossip and rumor mongering. A whisperer separates chief friends, creates problems, difficulties. Let's notice one of the other things that the Apostle Paul mentioned were those that were backbiters. Now, what does that mean, to be a backbiter? Well, that's a pretty descriptive word we have in English. A backbiter. The word in the Greek language is a word that simply means evil speakers. Evil speakers. And the sense, of course, of our English term backbiters is that they're speaking evil behind your back. Backbiters and whisperers sort of go together. Some of the principles that apply to one certainly apply to the other. There is a whisperer can include the whole gamut of rumors and gossip and tales that are told. A backbiter has to do specifically with things that are very evil and injurious. Notice in Psalm 140, in verse 3, it says, they have sharpened their tongues like adders. They've sharpened their tongue like a serpent. Adder's poison is under their lips. Coming on down in verse 11, let not an evil speaker be established in the earth. Evil shall hunt the violent man to overthrow him. Let not a backbiter, an evil speaker. The term in the Greek for backbiter is a word that literally translated means evil speaker. Let not an evil speaker be established in the earth, a backbiter. It talks about how they sharpen their tongue. The sense, of course, is though a sharp knife, something that is going to pierce, that is going to cut, that is going to hurt, it is going to inflict injury and pain. Let's notice a few other places. James chapter 4. Verse 11, it says, speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaks evil of his brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. If you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. Part of the problem here of speaking evil one of another is you're passing judgment on your brother. Let's understand a little bit. What does it mean to judge somebody? When we are talking about judging, it is an imputation, an imputing of motives. That's really what judging involves. Judging is not a statement of fact. Judgment is when you go beyond that and you start judging someone's motive, someone's attitude. You are putting yourself in the place of God, which is to look on a person's heart. Now, their actions may reflect certain things. If you see if you see someone do something, then you saw what they did. That's not you're not judging them to make a statement of fact. You are judging them when you start assuming motives. And of course, a lot of times, what we think we see and what we really saw aren't always the same thing. There was a movie that was shown, a short little movie, about a 15-minute movie that was shown at a refresher course in Pasadena several years ago, called In the Eye of the Beholder. And this particular little movie, it opened with a scene. And the scene gave one very distinct impression. It had to do with someone opening a door. And they looked in, and what they saw looked, absolutely terrible. They heard this noise, and they opened the door, they looked in, they saw this person lying down, they saw what looked like a pool of red there. Immediately, slammed the door and went out screaming. They knew, what was going on. Well, then we saw the rest of the story. We saw it from the perspective of inside, and what you saw was a painter and his model. What you saw was, someone falling. What you saw was totally different, totally innocent, totally innocuous, and yet there was a very quick jumping to conclusions. In the eye of the beholder, sometimes what you think you see and what you really see are two different things. But it says, speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaks evil of his brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. If you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. So, we're warned here about this evil speaking, and this term here for evil speaking, same term as for backbiter. Let's notice in Proverbs chapter 10. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 18. It says, he that hides hatred with lying lips and he that utters slander is a fool. In a multitude of words there wants not sin, but he that refrains his lips is wise. So, here's someone uttering a slander, backbiting, speaking evil. If you talk long enough and loud enough, you're going to say something you shouldn't say. In a multitude of words there wants not sin, he that refrains his lips is wise. The tongue of the just is as choice silver. The heart of the wicked is little worth. There's so many admonitions in the Scriptures here, and particularly in the book of Proverbs, about what we say. Let's just notice back in Proverbs chapter 26. Just one more area here, Proverbs 26. This is what sometimes happens when people are backbiters. It describes, in verse 17, he that passes by and meddles with strife, belonging not to him, is like one that takes a dog by the ears, as a madman who casts firebrands, arrows, and death. So is the man that deceives his neighbor and says, am I not in sport? You know what this is talking about? This is so often the reaction of people who get caught saying something and they say, oh, it was a joke. Can't you take a joke? Make some ugly comment, make some comment that's totally uncalled for. A person gets offended. Or they get called on and say, hey, I was just kidding. Am I not in sport? Hey, can't you take a joke? Well, as a madman that casts firebrands, arrows, and death. Somebody that's just gone crazy with rage, just throwing arrows, throwing firebrands. This is a man that deceives his neighbor, goes around and says things that shouldn't be said, and then tries to get out of it by saying it's joke. It's joke. Well, it's not a joke. It's not a joke as far as God is concerned. Something is not a joke unless it's funny to both people. That's one of the criteria of a joke. If it's not funny to both, it's not a joke. If you do something at someone else's expense and it's not funny to them, it's not a joke. It's not a joke. Holding someone up to ridicule is not a joke. Certainly there's place for humor. But we have to be very careful that it is appropriate humor. That it is not humor that in some way is going to be misused to hurt someone and to pull them down. So there's an important aspect here of this attitude of being a backbiter. God talks about this spirit of debate, of being argumentative and filled with strife and contention. He talks about being deceitful and full of guile and hypocrisy. He talks about whisperers and backbiters. And he talks about boasters in Romans chapter 1, verse 30. Boasters. Now, sometimes we don't put that in quite the same category, but you know God does. In fact, King Nebuchadnezzar learned to put boasters in a pretty high category too. When it was all over with, you remember the story that of King Nebuchadnezzar? In Daniel chapter 4, you know, part of the Bible was written by Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe you didn't know that. Chapter 4 quotes a letter that King Nebuchadnezzar wrote. Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, languages that dwell upon the earth, peace be multiplied. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God has wrought toward me. Nebuchadnezzar goes through and he tells this dream that he had, and he didn't understand what the dream meant. And he sent for Daniel, and Daniel came in, and in verse 19, Daniel was astonished for 1 hour. He just was speechless, and his thoughts troubled him. The king spoke and said, this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar, and about 12 months later, you know, he was really shook up for a while, but after a while, he sort of drifted back in his old way. And he was walking in the palace in the kingdom of Babylon, and the king spoke and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, for the honor of my majesty? And while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from you. Nebuchadnezzar finally learned in verse 34, when these 7 years were up, his understanding returned. He said, I bless the Most High, and praised and honored Him that lives forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And He does according to His will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay His hand or say, why do you do this? Verse 37, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and His ways judgment, and those that walk in pride He is able to abase. Those that walk in pride He is able to abase. Nebuchadnezzar was a boaster. He was filled with pride. Well, one of the reasons that God hates this attitude of boasting is because it totally distorts our relationship with God. Totally distorts our relationship with God. It is a focus on the self. It's a focus on self-greatness and how great I am and how powerful and how smart and how this and that and all the things. It is the very opposite of a meek attitude, an attitude of meekness. It's an attitude of being a boaster. Nebuchadnezzar learned that all that walk in pride, God is able to abase. James talks about it in James chapter 4. James chapter 4. Verse 10, he says, Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. Coming on down a little later in verse 13, he says, "Go to now, you that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. Well, you know not what shall be on the morrow. What is your life? It's even a vapor that appears for a little time and vanishes away." What you ought to say is, "If the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that." But now you rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil. Therefore, to him that knows to do good and does it not, to him it's sin. See, the problem with boasting is we lose sight of what we are. We lose sight that our life is just a vapor. We're here and we're gone. What man has power over his breath, over his spirit to retain it in the day of death? Oh, no. See, none of us determines those things. Oh, we can make plans. But our plans are very much subject to what God allows and to God's will. And a boaster is someone who has lost sight of his relationship with God and has lost sight of how great God is and how puny and insignificant and powerless we are. You see, the problems with these uses of the tongue is they reflect ways of thinking. And they spread those ways of thinking to others. They reflect self-centered ways of thinking. Ways of thinking that is totally filled with self. That is totally careless of the needs and the desires and the wishes of others. It reflects the very opposite attitudes to the ones that Jesus Christ himself reflected. It's not something that was characteristic of Jesus Christ in the way that he dealt. Now let's just look at one other aspect here. We've noticed a number of these in Romans 1. I would also like to call your attention just a little bit later in Romans. Paul mentions something else. And in Romans chapter 3 and verse 13, he talks again about the wicked. And he says in verse 12 of Romans 3, "They're all gone out of the way. They're together become unprofitable. There's none that does good, no, not one. Their throat is an open sepulcher." You know, a sepulcher was a cave. That was where they buried people. And it was covered up because it was viewed as containing all sorts of things inside that were unclean and unpalatable, things that smelled, things that were rotting, things that were decaying, things that would defile. So sepulchers were kept closed. But here are individuals whose throat is an open sepulcher. Their throat is an open sepulcher. And with their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips. So their bite is just as deadly as a snake, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace have they not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Because if the reverence and awe and respect for God is there, these things cannot hold a prominent place. It says, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Now here's one other category that we haven't noted. Whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. And these two certainly go together because they reflect a bitter attitude that spills out in bitter words and curses. The very opposite of outgoing concern, of love and consideration. In Psalm 64 in verse 2, in verse 1 it says, "Hear my voice, O God, in my prayer preserve my life from fear of the enemy. Hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, from the insurrection of the workers of iniquity, who whet their tongue like a sword, bend their bows to shoot their arrows, even bitter words that they may shoot in secret at the perfect, at the upright. Suddenly do they shoot at him and fear not. They encourage themselves in an evil matter. They commune of laying snares privately. They say, who shall see them? So here is shooting bitter words. Shooting bitter words. How many times have bitter words been spoken? Sometimes even in the context of people in the same family, husbands and wives. People who of all should love one another and cherish one another, and yet bitter words, words that reflect bitterness and harm, words that hurt and wound down deep inside. In 1 Peter chapter 3, we can only just touch the surface on some of the comments that are made, but I think it's sufficient. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8 it says, finally, be you of one mind, having compassion one of another. Love as brethren, be pitiful or full of pity. Be courteous. Oh, that'd solve a lot of problems. People just were courteous to one another. Use good manners. Not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but counterwise blessing, knowing that hereunto were you called, that you should inherit a blessing. He that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips that they speak no guile. Let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace and ensue it. The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, his ears are open unto their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. So, we're told here, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but counterwise a blessing. It's not yelling and screaming invectives and charges and countercharges. All sorts of cursing and accusation. Ephesians 4. Let's just notice one other place here. In Ephesians chapter 4, in verse 23, it says, be renewed in the spirit of your mind, that you put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness, wherefore putting away lying, speak everyone truth with his neighbor, for we're members one of another. Be you angry and sin not, let not the sun go down on your wrath, neither give place to the devil. Coming on down in verse 29, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, of building up, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. It's something that is gracious, that is uplifting, that is upbuilding. Let no corrupt communication, no cursing, no bitterness, no rotten, dirty speech, no vulgarity and things of that sort. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. But that which is good, to the use of edifying, it's building up. It's something that's helpful. It's clean and pretty and nice. It ministers grace unto the hearers. Grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby you're sealed unto the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away with all malice, and be you kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. That's the attitude that God wants us to have. Putting away the cursing, the bitterness, all of these things that are so descriptive of exactly the way that God does not want us to be as His people. Because these are things, our misuses of the tongue, are things of vital importance. You see, David asked the question in Psalm 15 and verse 1, Lord, who shall abide in your tabernacle? Who will dwell in your holy hill? Who's going to be in your kingdom and share life with you? Well, if I ask the question, how many of you want to be in the kingdom of God? I would hope that all of us would say, well, sure, I do. That's why I'm here. Who shall abide in your tabernacle? Who shall dwell in your holy hill? He that walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He that backbites not with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his neighbor. Oh, doesn't engage in whispering and backbiting and deceit? Oh, sounds like the way we use our tongue is going to be a big part. He that walks uprightly and works righteousness speaks the truth in his heart. Backbites not with his tongue, neither does evil to his neighbor, or takes up a reproach against his neighbor, in whose eyes a vile person is condemned, but he honors them that fear the Lord. He that swears to his own hurt and changes not, he that puts not his money to usury, nor takes reward against the innocent, he that does these things shall never be moved. The characteristics and qualities that God values, so many of them reflect themselves in the way that we use our tongue. David understood that. And that's why he said in Psalm 141, verse 1, Lord, I cry to you, make haste to hear me, give ear unto my voice when I cry unto you. Let my prayer be set before you as incense, the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice. Set a watch, O Lord, before my mouth. Keep the door of my lips. Incline not my heart to any evil thing, to practice wicked works with men that work iniquity. Let me not eat of their dainties. David said, look, Lord, I want to dwell with you in your holy hill. And I need help. Set a watch, O Lord, before my mouth. Put an armed guard there, God, to guard what gets out. Set a watch before my mouth. Keep the door of my lips. Help me not to incline my heart to any evil thing, to gossip and rumor and accusation. Help me not to be interested and attuned to those things. Let me not eat of their dainties. Let me not nibble away at the little tidbits of juicy gossip they have to pass out. Let me not feed on their gossip, on their dainties. Set a watch before my lips. You notice, it takes two things. You see, there's both the speaking and the hearing. I've always noticed with gossip that it takes at least two. I've never heard anyone gossip to themselves. Normally there's somebody there that's listening. Oh, I never gossip. I listen to a lot, but never gossip. Well, when you're there tuned in on it, you're participating. You're participating. Set a watch before my mouth. Keep the door of my lips. Let me not eat of their dainties. You know, what we say has a very direct implication and affects our relationship with God. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember your brother has aught against you, first go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. If you want to come before God and want to have a clean, open, wholesome relationship with God, and you know that you have hurt others, then you need to go and you need to apologize. You need to face up to what you did, and you need to apologize and clear it up and let them know that you're sorry and you're not going to do that again. And then you've got an open and a clean access to God. And we certainly need to be willing to forgive those who come and ask our forgiveness. We need to be very willing, because the willingness that we have is going to tie right into the willingness God has. Because if we're unwilling to forgive, then we won't be able to be forgiven. Scripture is very plain on that as well. We need to take very, very seriously. David did. He wanted his prayers to be received by God. He wanted God to listen when he talked. And so he asked God for help. He said, Father, help me control. Because you see, on our own, we can't totally, completely, always, in every case, But God can supply that help. Because you see, God starts with changing the inside. And it's out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. That's what we're told. Jesus said that in Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. In verse 43, he says, "A good tree brings not forth corrupt fruit, neither does a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree is known by his own fruit. Of thorns you don't gather figs, and of a bramble bush you don't gather grapes. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth that which is good. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth that which is evil. For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks." So ultimately, what we are, what we think, what we feel deep inside, our resentments, our envies, our jealousies, our insecurities, our feelings and attitudes deep inside are going to come out in the things that we say. We've got to go to God for the help to change what's on the inside, and we also have to go to Him for the help to set a watch, to set a guard in our mouth, and to simply keep it closed when it would be inappropriate to speak. James tells us perhaps the simplest and the most significant advice about dealing with problems of the tongue. James 1:19. "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath." You know, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. That ought to tell us something. He didn't give us 2 mouths and 1 ear. He gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. Maybe that tells us He figured we ought to do a little more listening and a little less talking. That's what James said. "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath."